Over the decades, people have worried about all sorts of influences that could be disseminated online, ranging in destructive power to tender young psyches, from smutty pictures, violence in video games, and of course, My Little Pony. Basically, if it exists, the people who have made a living acting like they are far more moral than the rest of us have claimed to worry about it. But they seem unwilling to point out the most damaging toxic export of the internet and social media, mostly because it's right up their alley as inflexible, self-righteous moral scolds. And that lies in mobilizing people through anger and convincing true believers that everyone else is the problem. We gussy up the idea by talking about something being divisive or polarizing, which is still blaming the thing in itself, when in fact, it is just a template for people to be irrationally angry, mostly because they want to. Anger is seductive in those suffering from other weaknesses of character. Take a typical example where everyone gets to be angry about everything. Recently, YouTuber and Australian Sydney Watson, although she can't be blamed for either, complained about her experience being sandwiched between two morbidly obese people on a flight. Their girth was such that they impinged on her personal space, so much so that she couldn't even put down her armrests or use her seat-back tray table. She spent hours in this flesh vice, having to contort until she ached. Flying by itself is usually an exercise in being a human sardine, breathing recycled high-altitude air and playing chicken with deep vein thrombosis. In normal circumstances, anyone making unwanted physical contact like that could be accused of some form of assault, sexual or otherwise. But the whole body positivity and healthy at any size contingent demanded that she be the bad person in this situation. People that overweight probably don't feel very good about it and are aware of being an imposition on others, and so anger gives them an easy way out. Sometimes the easiest way to outrage people is in affirming what they already know. Maybe they can't stop anyone from talking about it this time, but if they give someone a hard enough time, maybe it will avoid mention in the future. Today's rage is often conducted in anticipation of causing tomorrow's silence. Social media is an economy of anger deployed to diminish responsibility and attack targets of opportunity. The term usually used is outrage, but that's just another fancy dress term for anger. And anger is the driving force of everything from clickbait about how doctors hate this simple trick to the ostracizing of people through cancel culture. To understand why it is that a social movement like wokeness, that makes claim to being tolerant and inclusive, non-judgmental, and more interested in cooperation than competition, while embodying all the worst aspects of witch hunters, you have to turn to models of individual human pathological behavior as acted out by a group. You have to think of cancel culture in pathological terms because its aim, from which it gets its name, is to outrage people so much that they fall on another person, cause them to lose their jobs, lose any platform they may have, interfere with their status and social standing, and otherwise ostracize and exile them in a way that is entirely disproportionate to anything they actually did. The same way they would cancel something with a rubber stamp, if that stamp was on the sole of a boot stomping on their victim's face. In fact, canceling someone is so logically and proportionally disconnected from any sense of just desserts that it may well be that the point of cancel culture is not to cancel people per se, but to enrage people artificially as part of a mob mentality, enough that they will engage in the pathological behavior of canceling. And canceling is just a placeholder for murder itself. Until they can actually kill people, it will have to do. As it has been said, people who believe absurdities will commit atrocities. And as I have said, the purpose of witch burnings isn't to burn witches, as no witches are ever burned. The point of that hysteria is to imbue people with the necessary level of fanaticism for them to burn innocent people as witches with complete moral conviction. The purpose of witch burning is to create witch burners. Also, participating in cancel culture doesn't mean they need to get their hands dirty. They need not stack kindling against the stake, as making enough noise in order to get someone fired or ostracized is largely an act of administrative abuse, having a proxy to do the deed for them. Anger expressed without any real chance of reprisal is a cowardly sort of thing. The power of the irrational anger of cancel culture is that most people have no response to that level of dysfunctional anger, even if you think you do. To paraphrase Mike Tyson, everyone has a plan until they are set upon by feral pigs on social media. And people who use anger as a weapon know that. Anything you do to infuse some reason into the situation, anything you do to assuage their anger, just gives them license to be angrier. Mostly because really angry people see any attempt at placating their anger as weakness, as evidence that their anger is working, or simply find the implication that they shouldn't be so angry to be deeply offensive to the righteous justification they find in anger. That is to say, by its very nature, anger is a cul-de-sac. It's where the conversation ends, which also fits in nicely with cancel culture's views on having that conversation, as the woke say when they're trying to sound reasonable. That is, when they're gaslighting you. They don't want to have that conversation, or any conversation. They just want to shut people up, have them cede the field, and gain victory by default. Anger means never having to ask yourself why. Anger doesn't involve very much self-reflection. That is, people who are angry rarely ask themselves if they have sufficient cause to be angry, whether the anger is proportional, or what anger gets them anyway. People are more likely to question their empathy than their anger, because anger completely externalizes blame. People don't choose to be angry, according to angry people. Other people make them angry. For that reason, anger goes hand in hand with self-righteousness. It's always somebody else's fault. Disagreement expressed through anger is a perfect vehicle to dehumanize and denigrate others. Objects of anger are always treated as lesser than, never given the benefit of making an honest mistake. Anger also feeds into the narcissist's belief in their own centrality, in that everything done is done to them. Things aren't merely a byproduct of other people going about their business. Anger allows the outraged narcissist to maintain the focus on themselves. For that reason, anger, with its externalization of blame, lack of self-reflection, and self-righteousness, fits very nicely into the playbook of cluster B personalities, including narcissistic personality disorder and borderline personality disorder. I will go a step further here to claim that outrage and cancel culture represent the normalization and organization of the cluster B personality type. It doesn't actually matter whether or not individuals are cluster B. Participation in outrage and cancel culture demands they act like one. If you've ever seen one of those exceptionally creepy historical photographs of a lynching, which I will reproduce here only by keeping the murdered out of frame, you will notice that not only are men, women, and children present, but they seem to treat it as a social event, a form of social cohesion through shared horror, in which the actual murder of another human being is almost an afterthought, the most gruesome sort of decoration. Although I have always thought the party atmosphere of these events were a form of whistling in the graveyard. Because what do these people learn is in store for them should they start coloring outside the lines? Today you burn the witch. Tomorrow you are accused of being one. For that reason, one of the great motivations of people deploying anger is fear. Not fear of the person they are currently expressing anger towards, but fear of becoming that person themselves should the rules change. And the rules always change. There are always new rules. That things that are transgressions today weren't yesterday provides a capricious uncertainty that lends itself nicely to the underlying aim, which is power and control. It's one thing to police others, coerce them to behave in a certain way. It's another thing to make them realize that they are always on super secret double probation to make them police themselves. One of the mysteries of cancel culture is how so many people engaged in it don't think the rules apply to them. Usually this is because the rules don't apply to them until complacency makes them push their immunity one step too far. The rules don't apply until they do. And anyone who makes a comment about gassing someone first, an obvious Holocaust reference, even if the person making the remark is themselves Jewish, may just be a toe outside the bounds of immunity. That's one of the dangers in a practice that demands far more from other people than they do for themselves. An own goal, hoisting oneself with one's own petard, is an inevitable, predictable result. In the dystopian totalitarian state of Orwell's 1984, it's by design that the only outlet for expression the citizens of Oceania had was anger expressed through the 2 minutes hate and as a bloodthirsty mob during public executions. Anger and hatred are not only visceral, but cheap, and very useful in twisted psychotic systems where more time is spent ranting against systemic this and systemic that, all in the service of ginned-up systemic anger. And we now exist in an atmosphere of systemic anger and performative rage. Cancel culture aspires to be the firing squad in the town square, the social circle around the gallows. The trick is in limiting every response to anger. Comedy was one of the first forms of expression to fall to the outrage mob because humor gives an outlet to repurpose slights and allow people to recognize the commonality of their experiences. Humor, by its very nature, and in the way it encourages social bonding, diffuses anger. The last thing that outrage culture wants anyone to do is to process anger in any constructive way. Why let people have a catharsis when they can be smashing shop windows and throwing soup on pricey paintings? One of the worst acts of complacency committed by people years ago was in seeing this pathological behavior and assuming it would limit itself to academia and social media. Now, you can't even have a hobby without fear of being canceled. This mode of self-righteous anger and social cohesion by othering has become so pervasive that it has cropped up in, of all places, communities devoted to knitting. However, its appearance in scale modeling is a little easier to understand. For those wondering what that is all about, scale modeling aims to create historically accurate reproductions of artifacts and pieces of technology, tanks and planes and ships, that sort of thing. Military technology often have insignias and other identifying marks. If you ever built models as a kid, these were the water transfer decals that invariably stuck to everything except the model. And now you know exactly where this is going. On German military equipment from the mid-20th century, the Balkan Cruise, the Iron Cross, appears far more frequently, but now and then its far more offensive cousin does put in an appearance, notably on the terrifying pilot-dissolving Me-163 Comet and the iconic Me-262. Some people choose to be outraged because they claim that including that particular German symbol from the 1930s, which appear in their historical context, are not included due to historical accuracy, but because the model maker is advocating for the particular 1930s German ideology it represents. A claim so ludicrous that the person making it can't possibly be arguing in good faith. Rather, they are latching onto the thinnest of pretexts for outrage. And they really can't claim that context doesn't matter, because the same symbol appears repeatedly in Hindu and Native American art, and no one is losing it over that. Besides, if you're going to engage in these sort of mental gymnastics, you might as well claim that not including the proper decal on a model is whitewashing history because, like Mountain Dew, you think Hitler did nothing wrong. If you are going to engage in mental gymnastics, then everyone should get a swing on the uneven bars. The outrage is symbolic in that it literally revolves around a symbol and the ludicrous assumption that recognition of a symbol and the context in which it appears is claimed to be advocacy of what it represents. One of the consistent claims of outrage merchants is that depiction is necessarily advocacy, except when they do it. It's like claiming a model sailing ship bearing the Jolly Roger is advocacy of piracy on the high seas. What's important, however, is that it takes something that was never at issue, the representation of a historically accurate insignia and symbols, and introduces a new rule which makes no sense whatsoever, except for its ability to create ready-made outrage. What this has to do with scale modeling is exactly nothing. It's simply the introduction of outrage culture, organized anger, into a community for power and control. Power and control, like outrage and anger, being its own end. You've got to figure at this point people will try to introduce this tactic into communities so far removed from the usual lacuna of wokeness, just to see if it will work, to see if they can become potentate of their local knitting circle. For all the worry about smut and violence of previous times, very little thought seems to be given to what effect this level of outrage and anger for anger's sake, or anger for dominance and control, will have on people growing up thinking this is normal. But the capriciousness of it, the unfairness, and the disproportionality of it all must be taking a toll. They claim that they want people to have conversations, in which they want people to advocate for what they think is right. But they really don't mean it when they act as though people are simply horrible, deserving of merciless destruction for taking their own side in an argument. Like all the other rules, allowing people to act according to their lived experience gets thrown out when there's outrage to be had. The constant refrain of rules for thee but not for me, where the people who make the rules don't have to follow them, is yet another way of warping people's moral compass by teaching them the only rule, really, is the exercise of raw power. What this may accomplish is creating people far too weak and cowed to stand up for themselves. And weak people invariably not only express themselves through anger, but through violence, when and if they can get away with it. Where there are no rules, or the rules are subject to change without notice, there's really no point in pretending that there is some rule where you can't start hacking away at the people who beat you down. If I am any good at predictions, I predict that timidity and violence will go hand in hand. The idea of the bullied mass shooter that began with Columbine, which is more or less a myth, may actually start coming true. When people learn there's no way to win, when they have nothing left to lose, and when anger is the only currency, this outcome seems to be manifest. That is the price we will pay for tolerating confabulated madness. Between 1958 and 1962, Norwegian ethologist John B. Calhoun conducted a series of experiments that came to be known as the behavioral sink. He created a community of rodents and then put the population under extreme stress. The stressor in his community of rodents was overcrowding, but all overcrowding did was make it so its inhabitants could not have their needs met. If you predicted that each individual rat began to express antisocial behavior, including mothers literally eating their young and rats killing and cannibalizing each other, you would be right. Whatever cohesion there may be in group pathology, the breakdown results in the far more horrifying violence that can be expressed by individuals. The experiment started as a mouse utopia, but it didn't take much to make a utopia hell on earth, especially considering the kind of people who think they are qualified to create utopias. What overcrowding did was cause the spiritual death of the rats through social breakdown. Considering that there are many ways we can bring about spiritual death in humans, we are clearly descended into our own behavioral sink, driven not by overpopulation, but the economy of anger that artificially creates outrage for its own sake and applies merciless, life-changing punishment for violations of rules, minor infractions even, which are never clear and always subject to change without notice. Were it not for the anger economy's ability to create targets by externalizing blame, the members of outrage culture would start eating each other. We've already seen it happen at a feminist conference where women began balkanizing themselves in order to get a leg up in victimhood status until some claimed they were being oppressed, their well-being threatened by other women's perfume. At the 2019 Socialism Conference, which operated on the motto of no borders, no bosses, no binaries, they began sniping at each other because the background chatter was said to trigger some neuroatypical members, and then they completely lost their minds over gendered language when one speaker casually referred to the group as guys. Clearly, some of these people were a little more interested in erecting barriers, being boss, and engaging in some severely binary black and white thinking. That vying for power and control through manufactured outrage would seem comical until you think if that's what they do to each other, imagine what they will do to you. You can almost hear the sound of boning knives scraping against whetstones. Remember, the only reason why these sorts of people have not constructed gulags and solved dissent with a bullet to the back of the head is due to a lack of opportunity, not a lack of will. When anger is the only currency, when people's anger absolves them of personal responsibility, there is no way to put the brakes on, as there's never any sense of having gone too far. All riots, burning down of cities, are soft-pedaled as mostly peaceful, and even if they're not, still considered completely justified regardless of the inciting incident. Again, I am not predicting that we will end up in the behavioral sink. I'm saying we are already in it. And there is absolutely no way for us to painlessly extricate ourselves from it. To not follow the arbitrary dictates of outrage culture will invariably be treated as the greatest outrage of all. Asking people to so much as reflect on whether their self-serving anger is justifiable and the consequences proportionate will do nothing but make some people really, really pissed off. And right there is the decision we need to make. Do we rip off the bandage quickly or do it very, very slowly? Any way that we affirm people's right to have their own opinion and express it without fear of reprisal will offend the toxic narcissists by not humoring them when they claim any disagreement with them constitutes a moral failing of others. Should we stand for people's right to be all kinds of wrong? And people should have a right to express opinions even if they are demonstrably wrong. The more violent will be the convulsion of organized anger expressed in outrage culture. It's no accident that affirming the liberal values of openness and tolerance will get the most outraged and angry response from the culture of outrage. Then again, it's really just a choice of what kind of violence will precipitate depending on where we halt our descent into this behavioral sink. You have to ask yourself which you prefer, The outrage of LARPing cancel culture tantrums, or the real violence of people who have had their lives destroyed, all hope extinguished, and left with nothing to lose by the insincere performative anger of cancel culture? To give some answer to my original question, I have no idea what the long-term effects will be in raising people to be cowed and timid until they get the chance to be opportunistic killers like a pack of hyenas. But I can only see that as being pathological and all kinds of ugly. Think of it as the ugly of a passage through hell, or at least limbo. But the hell of a Hieronymus Bosch painting where, whether they know it or not, people choose their own hell. It's already gotten ugly. And the economy of anger only means it's going to get a whole lot uglier. We no longer have a choice in it. We can only choose the kind of ugly we go through. And whether we face that ugly to affirm the right of people to express all kinds of views, including those that are unpopular, impolitic, or even wrong, and reject the ugliness of outrage and anger for its own sake as a means to a terrible end. Feel free to engage with me on my content, and of course, like, comment, and share. And a special thank you to those of you supporting me on Patreon, PayPal, or Subscribestar. You've gone a long way towards getting me out of some dire circumstances, but I'm not out of the woods yet. I'm still working on it, and I'll get there with your help.